Please leave a comment where in the world you are listening from. I was moving from Florida to DC and was going to load up my car as much as I could with stuff. However, I lived on the third floor plus a bit of a walk from my assigned parking spot, so I figured I could use some help. I posted an ad on Craigslist gigs. I said I was looking for someone to help me load some heavy items like TV, desk, etc. in my car. Less than an hour's worth of work, and I'd pay $45 or whatever. I give the very first responder my number and address, and he shows up. He was probably 5 feet 8 inches and 350 pounds of pure fat. The sweat and smell coming off of this guy in the Florida heat was pretty nauseating, but I didn't care as long as he did the job right. While he was carting heavy stuff, I was loading lighter things. Whenever I'd go upstairs to grab another load, he'd hurry after me so he could walk up the stairs behind me. I had the door propped open, so he didn't have to worry about me needing to unlock the door for him or anything. When he'd follow me up the stairs, he made these weird grunting noises like mmhm, but I assumed it was because he was out of shape. Eventually, everything's loaded properly, save for some sweat smears on my stuff. I pay him, and he drives off. I go back in my place to finish loading and cleaning. I go out maybe 45 minutes later to put another load in my car, and I see his truck is back, parked across the street from mine. He's sitting in the driver's seat, looking at me. When he sees me notice him, he looks away. I walk over to his window and knock. He rolls it down, and I ask if he needs any help or if he was lost. I was really confused as to why he had come back, and I knew he didn't live near me. He didn't say anything, just rolled his window back up and drove off. I'm okay, whatever. Of course, 5 minutes later, my phone starts blowing up. I don't recognize the number, so I don't answer the calls. Then texts start rolling in. Him, I bet you taste salty and sweet. Me, who is this? Him, your puss. Him, what you up to tonight? I can come back over. I get this sinking feeling it's the Craigslist guy. He had never called me about the job when I gave him my number, so I didn't know what his number was. Him, I like your pink underwear. Then I realize he was looking up my dress when I was walking up the stairs. I immediately feel like a total idiot for wearing a dress that day. He then started dialing my number over and over again. I didn't know how to do the block number thing through Sprint, so I had to just turn my phone off. Later, I was with my guy friend grabbing a bite and turned my phone back on. I got another text from the guy about how he wanted to toss me around like a rag doll and tie me up and make me beg for it. I show the text to my friend and tell him the story. The Craigslist creep then proceeds to start blowing up my phone again. So my friend answers and says he is going to cut his dick off and feed it to his dog if he ever contacts me again. I moved the next day, so I never had to worry about him randomly showing up in his truck again. Since then, I've bought and sold stuff on Craigslist, but I always make people meet me at a public place. I also stalk people's email addresses, Google Plus accounts, etc. I was 18 at the time, and like most 18-year-olds, I was feeling equal parts adventurous and stupid. I decided to post on Craigslist looking for a pet and master relationship. It seemed like a good idea at the time. I was young, curious, and had just discovered this whole underground world of kink. It felt exciting, taboo, and completely different from the vanilla high school relationships I'd experienced so far. Of course, I didn't think things through past the initial thrill, but that's hindsight for you. The responses poured in almost immediately. Most of them were the predictable "Hey cutie" or "You up" messages you'd expect from a platform like Craigslist. Some were straight up creepy, guys who clearly thought pet meant something a lot weirder than what I was looking for. Others just felt off, like dudes who couldn't spell a full sentence or sent blurry bathroom selfies as their profile pics. I also got flagged more times than I could count, which should have been a sign to stop, but 18-year-old me didn't believe in signs. Eventually, I ran into someone who seemed promising? That's probably too strong a word. Let's just say he didn't immediately make me want to block him. He was polite, articulate, and actually seemed to understand what I was looking for. He asked a lot of questions, normal ones at first, like what I was into and what kind of dynamic I wanted. Then things got a little more specific. He wanted proof that I was real and not some bored catfish screwing with him. So he had me send pictures of myself doing random things, holding up 3 fingers, placing my hand on my forehead, stuff like that. In retrospect, it felt a bit like auditioning for a weird, low-budget role I didn't understand yet. But at the time, it made sense, so I went along with it. After chatting for a bit, we decided to meet at a hotel later that night. The plan was that I'd bring the toys, since apparently that responsibility fell on me, and wear my slave outfit under my dress. Looking back, I think I was more excited about putting the outfit together than actually meeting him. It felt like playing a character, stepping into some sultry, forbidden role. I packed my silk ties, mostly because they seemed safer than actual restraints in case things went south, and headed out. Meeting him in person was surprisingly normal at first. He wasn't creepy, which honestly felt like a win right away. He was polite, well-spoken, and older, definitely older. Not sugar daddy old, but definitely past the point where he should have been hanging out in Craigslist personals. I told myself it didn't matter. I was an adult, he was an adult, and this was what I wanted, or thought I wanted. Things got weird pretty quickly, though. After the small talk, he told me he was really into women with bush. Like really into it. I guess I hadn't done my homework, because I'd shaved beforehand, assuming that's what most guys preferred. The second he saw, his whole demeanor shifted. He wasn't mean about it, but there was this undeniable look of disappointment, like I'd shown up to a job interview without pants. He even made a few sad comments about it, like he was mourning the loss of something sacred. Still, we moved forward with the plan. He said I had to shower with him first and wash him. I tried to roll with it, treating it like part of the role play, but it was hard to ignore how awkward it felt. It wasn't sexy or intimate. It was mechanical, like bathing a stranger in a hospital or something. The whole time, he kept looking down at me like I'd let him down in some profound way. It was unsettling, but I kept going because at that point, I was already too far in to back out. After the shower, we moved to the bed. I brought out my silk ties, mostly because I didn't trust him enough to let him tie me up with anything more serious. He seemed fine with it, tied me up, and we had sex. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't good either. It was just fine, like eating plain oatmeal when you were expecting pancakes. Once we were done, he said he wanted me to stay the night, but he had somewhere to be. He got dressed, gave me a polite goodbye, and left me sitting in a strange hotel room feeling equal parts used and relieved. I stayed there for a while, partly because I didn't want to seem too eager to leave and partly because I needed a minute to process what had just happened. When I finally left, I texted him later to let him know I didn't think this was going to work out. I told him he was too old for me, which was probably the nicest excuse I could come up with. He took it surprisingly well, which honestly made me feel worse. He didn't beg or guilt-trip me, just said he understood and wished me luck. The problem was he had a video of me. That part still haunts me. I don't know why I let him film in the first place. Probably some combination of naivety and wanting to seem cool and experienced. But after we parted ways, I started panicking about what he might do with it. I still Google my name from time to time, terrified that it's going to show up somewhere. So far, nothing's come up, but the anxiety never really goes away. Looking back, I can't even say it was a horrible experience. Weird, definitely. Awkward, for sure. But not traumatic or scarring. Just one of those things you do when you're young and dumb and trying to figure yourself out. He wasn't a bad guy, just not the kind of master I was looking for. Too gentle, too polite, too disappointed about my lack of pubic hair. If anything, the experience taught me a lot about what I actually wanted and, more importantly, what I didn't want. I learned that just because someone seems nice online doesn't mean they're a good fit in real life. I also learned that I'm not as into power dynamics as I thought I was, or at least not in the way Craigslist strangers advertise them. So yeah, that's the story of my brief foray into Craigslist kink. It's not something I'd recommend to others, but I also don't regret it. Sometimes you have to go through the weird stuff to figure out who you are. And sometimes you just end up scrubbing a stranger in a hotel shower while they mourn your lack of pubic hair. Either way, it's a hell of a story to tell later. This was back in February of this year. I was down in Texas for work. I live in North Dakota. For whatever reason, I got this idea in my head, completely out of nowhere. I had never even used Craigslist before, but I thought, why not give it a shot? Maybe it was boredom, maybe it was the unfamiliarity of being away from home, but I decided to hop on and check out the infamous casual encounters section. Scrolling through the ads was like diving into the bizarre corners of the internet I'd only heard about. Most of the posts were unappealing or downright terrifying. People with odd requests, photos that shouldn't exist, and grammar that made me lose faith in humanity. But then one caught my eye. The ad was simple and straightforward. The girl was looking for a friend with benefits who was tall, skinny, and into nerdy shit. Now, I'm not one to toot my own horn, but that sounded a lot like me. Tall? Check. Skinny? Check. Into nerdy shit. I could probably write essays on that. Figuring I'd see where this went, I responded to her ad with a quick message and a picture of myself. She replied surprisingly fast, with a face pic of her own. I won't lie, her photo wasn't bad. She had a nice smile, soft features, and seemed approachable. We exchanged a few more messages before transitioning to an actual phone call. The conversation flowed easily, like we'd known each other for years, not strangers connecting on Craigslist. After about an hour of chatting, she gave me her address and invited me over. At this point, I'm still thinking, what's the worst that could happen? I stopped at a nearby gas station to pick up some condoms, because hey, better safe than sorry, right? As I pulled up to her place, a small voice in the back of my head whispered that maybe I was getting in over my head, but I ignored it. When she opened the door, I was hit with an immediate wave of realization. This was not the girl from the picture she had sent me. Not even close. She was severely overweight, a solid 3 times the size of what I'd imagined based on her photo. My brain was still trying to process this massive bait and switch when, before I could say a word, she launched herself at me. I mean, full-on shoved her face into mine and started making out. Not a single word exchanged between us. In that moment, my brain sort of shut down. I wasn't operating on logic or reason anymore. I think my body just went into autopilot, letting my instincts or hormones take the wheel. I told myself, you're here now. Might as well see where this goes. Now, let me set the scene for you. This wasn't the fun, steamy encounter you might see in a movie or read about in one of those trashy romance novels. No, this was chaos. She was sloppy, ridiculously sloppy. Her tongue was all over my face like she was trying to lick peanut butter off my cheeks. I tried to go with it, thinking maybe things would improve once we got to the main event. Spoiler alert, they did not. When we moved to the bedroom, things took a turn I was not prepared for. She climbed on top of me, and I did my best to keep the situation under control. But then, the moment happened, the one that seared into my memory forever. She turned around while on top of me, giving me a full view of what can only be described as the hairiest butthole I have ever seen in my life. I'm not talking about a little stubble or a few stray hairs. I'm talking full-on 1970s porn star hairy. It was like she had a small forest growing back there. I stared in disbelief, my brain struggling to comprehend the sight in front of me. The front, while not hairless, was at least somewhat tamed. But this? This was something else entirely. It felt like a fevered dream, like I had stepped into a bizarre alternate dimension where nothing made sense. Eventually, the situation concluded. I'm not going to lie and say it was some epic, climactic ending. It was more like both of us realizing this had gone on long enough. I scrambled to come up with an excuse to leave, mumbling something about work in the morning. She seemed disappointed but didn't press the issue, so I made my escape. When I got back to my hotel, I immediately jumped into the shower, scrubbing myself like I was trying to erase the whole experience from my body. I climbed into bed, exhausted, and hoped that would be the end of it. The next day, I left my phone in my hotel room while I went to work. By the time I got back, I discovered 35 missed calls from her. 35. She had also left 3 voicemails, each one 2 minutes long, where she was crying hysterically. Full-on sobbing. I listened to a few seconds of the first one before deleting all of them. I didn't respond to her calls or messages. There was no way I was going to open that door again, figuratively or literally. In hindsight, the whole experience was a mess from start to finish. I went in expecting some casual fun, and instead, I walked away with a story that still makes me cringe when I think about it. I learned a valuable lesson that day. Don't trust Craigslist photos, and maybe don't go looking for hookups in strange cities where you don't know anyone. All in all, it was a terrible situation, one I would not recommend to anyone who values their self-respect. Sure, it's a funny story now, but at the time, it was just plain awful. If you're ever tempted to do something like this, take a step back and think it through. Chances are, the potential for disaster far outweighs the slim chance of a good outcome. As for me, I'll stick to more traditional ways of meeting people from now on. Looking back, I'm still not sure what compelled me to respond to that ad in the first place. Maybe it was the novelty of trying something new, or maybe it was the anonymity of being in a city where no one knew me. Whatever the reason, I can confidently say I won't be making that mistake again. Some experiences are better left to the imagination, and this was definitely one of them. So there you have it, a cautionary tale of one man's Craigslist adventure gone horribly wrong. If nothing else, it's a reminder that sometimes it's better to swipe left than to answer an ad in the casual encounters section. I went out to get drinks with a girl I met on Craigslist. It was one of those spur-of-the-moment decisions that seemed like a good idea at the time. Low stakes, high potential for excitement, and the kind of situation that either turns into a wild story or a cautionary tale. Either way, I figured it was worth rolling the dice. We met at a bar not far from my apartment. She showed up looking better than I expected. Cute, put together, and surprisingly normal for someone I found in the depths of Craigslist. She had this nervous energy about her, though like she was trying way too hard to seem chill. I chalked it up to first meeting jitters and ordered us a couple of drinks to break the ice. A couple of drinks quickly turned into several rounds, and before I knew it, we were both completely trashed. The conversation was all over the place. One minute we were talking about movies, and the next she was confessing to sneaking booze into her sister's wedding reception. I'm not even sure how half the topics came up, but we were laughing the whole time, and the drinks just kept flowing. By the time we stumbled out of the bar, it was clear where the night was headed. She grabbed my hand as we walked back to my apartment, leaning into me like she needed me to keep her upright. It felt easy and natural, even if we were both too drunk to be making good decisions. That started to change as soon as we got to my building. She went from flirty and carefree to visibly nervous. She kept glancing around, fidgeting with her purse and wiping her palms on her jeans. I asked if she was okay, and she forced out a laugh and said, "Yeah, totally. Just drunk, I guess." We made it to the stairs, and that's when things got weird. Every step we took, she seemed to get more anxious. By the time we reached my door, she was practically drenched in sweat. I unlocked the door, and as soon as it closed behind us, she did this exaggerated, cartoonish wipe of her brow and let out a huge exhale, like she'd just finished running a marathon. At this point, I was too drunk to overthink it. I figured she was just nervous about hooking up with someone she barely knew. Makes sense, right? So I cracked a joke to lighten the mood, handed her a drink from my fridge, and things escalated from there. The sex itself was fine, nothing mind-blowing, but not terrible either. She seemed into it, although there were a couple of moments where she froze up a little before shaking it off and getting back into it. At the time, I assumed it was just the alcohol messing with her head. Now, I'm not so sure. Afterward, she didn't stick around long. She got dressed pretty quickly, gave me a quick kiss, and said something about needing to get up early. I didn't think much of it. One-night stands aren't exactly known for lingering goodbyes, so I let her go and passed out shortly after. The next morning, I woke up hungover, but feeling pretty good about how the night had gone. I figured I'd text her later and see if she wanted to hang out again, but I didn't get the chance. A couple of days later, I'm heading out to grab some groceries when I see her coming out of the apartment across the hall. At first, I thought I was still half asleep and imagining things, but nope. It was definitely her. She froze the second she saw me, her eyes going wide like a deer caught in headlights. Before I could even process what was happening, my neighbor, a guy I'd exchanged maybe 5 words with since moving in, steps out behind her. He throws his arm around her shoulders and gives me this huge grin. "Hey man, this is my girlfriend, Jess. Jess, this is my neighbor." She laughed nervously and stuck out her hand like we hadn't already had sex in my apartment less than 48 hours ago. I shook it because, honestly, what else was I supposed to do? My brain was still scrambling to catch up with the situation, and I didn't trust myself to form actual words yet. They stood there for a few more seconds, making awkward small talk, before heading out together. I just stood in the hallway like an idiot, replaying the whole thing in my head and trying to make sense of it. It didn't take long for everything to click. The nervousness at the bar, the sweating bullets on the stairs, the exaggerated sigh of relief when the door closed behind us. She wasn't nervous about hooking up with a stranger, she was nervous about getting caught. And now I was standing in the aftermath, trying to figure out whether I'd just been a drunk mistake or part of some weird game she was playing. Over the next few weeks, I saw them together constantly. Every time I left my apartment, it felt like they were there, coming in, going out, or hanging around the hallway. She always gave me this tight, forced smile whenever we crossed paths, and he was oblivious to the whole thing, chatting me up about football or complaining about parking spaces. I kept waiting for her to say something, to pull me aside and explain, but she never did. Eventually, I stopped expecting her to. She wasn't going to risk blowing up her relationship over one drunken night, and honestly, I didn't want to deal with the drama either. Still, it made things weird. Every time I heard them through the wall, I couldn't help but wonder if he knew, or if he'd find out. I started dreading the possibility of some angry knock on my door at 2 a.m., but it never came. After a couple of months, they moved out. I never found out why. Maybe he got a new job, or maybe she wanted to avoid running into me. Either way, I didn't see her again after that. I'd be lying if I said I didn't think about it every now and then, though. Not in a regretful way, just more like curiosity. Did she feel guilty? Was it just a random thrill for her? Or was it something else entirely? I'll probably never know, but I do know one thing. I haven't touched Craigslist Personals since. Some stories just don't need sequels. I met my last girlfriend via Craigslist, specifically through the furniture for sale section. It's not exactly the kind of origin story most people expect when they ask, "So, how did you two meet?" But that's what made it fun to tell. Watching people's faces twist in confusion when we said, "Oh, Craigslist," before we'd clarify the details, was half the fun. Anyway, it all started because I just moved into a new, larger house. I finally had enough space to put together the kind of entertainment room I'd always wanted. Big screen, surround sound, the works. The only thing missing was the seating. I didn't want to just throw a couple of random couches in there. I wanted theater seating. Big, plush, reclining chairs. Something that made it clear this was a room for movies, not casual small talk. I browsed Craigslist, figuring I could save some money buying used instead of dropping a fortune at a furniture store. After scrolling past an endless sea of ugly mismatched junk, I found them. 3 gorgeous leather recliners in perfect condition. The kind that looked like they belonged in a home theater showroom. I shot off an email asking if they were still available, half expecting to get ghosted or scammed, but the seller got back to me within an hour. We exchanged a few emails to sort out the details, and I agreed to drive about 45 minutes out of town to pick them up. Up until that point, it was just a straightforward transaction. She gave me the address, I loaded the chairs onto my truck, and that should have been the end of it. But then, as I was getting ready to leave, something stopped me. I don't know if it was the way she smiled when we shook hands, or the fact that she was ridiculously beautiful, way more than I'd expected for someone selling furniture online, but I suddenly felt like I'd regret it if I didn't say something. That's when the thought hit me, you may only pass this way but once. Now, I'm not exactly Casanova, so what came out of my mouth next was awkward, to say the least. I asked if there were any good places to eat nearby, and mentioned I was in the mood for sushi. Smooth, right? She paused for a second, and I thought, well, that's it. She's either married, taken, or completely creeped out by me. But then she smiled, this warm, almost amused smile, and told me about a sushi place just a few minutes down the road. That should have been the end of it, but for some reason, I didn't let it go. I took a deep breath, pushed past the nerves, and asked if she'd want to join me. I'll never forget the way she tilted her head and said, "You know what? I'm actually kind of hungry too." I couldn't believe it. One minute I was picking up chairs from a stranger, and the next I was sitting across from her at a sushi restaurant, learning about her life. It turned out the chairs had been bought for her ex-boyfriend, who had taken off shortly after she set up the entertainment room. She'd held on to them for a while, not ready to let go, but finally decided to sell them and make a fresh start. We bonded over that, the whole idea of starting over. She had just gotten out of a bad relationship, and I had just moved to a new town where I didn't know many people. By the time dinner was over, it felt like we'd known each other for years. We laughed, we drank a little sake, and we both pretended not to notice how long we were lingering after the check had already been paid. From there, things moved fast but naturally. We started texting almost immediately, and by the end of the week, we'd already gone out again. This time intentionally, not as an add-on to a Craigslist deal. She helped me set up the chairs in my entertainment room, and I helped her rearrange her apartment since she'd finally cleared out the last reminders of her ex. Before long, the chairs became our chairs. Movie nights at my place turned into lazy Sunday mornings and late-night conversations about everything from bad exes to dream vacations. Those chairs saw everything, the early butterflies, the first I love you, and even the petty arguments about what movie to watch. And no one ever believed us when we told them how we met. People assumed we were joking, or that we'd met online in some more conventional way, like a dating app. But we always let them sit in the confusion for a minute before dropping the real story. It became a party trick of sorts, watching their faces cycle through shock, disbelief, and amusement. I won't pretend it was some perfect fairy tale romance. We had our ups and downs, like any couple. There were fights about dumb things, compromises we didn't always want to make, and moments where we both wondered if we were moving too fast. But there were also a lot of good times, camping trips, concerts, and lazy weekends where we barely left the couch. Eventually, though, life got in the way. She got a new job that required her to move out of state, and I wasn't ready to leave the home I'd just settled into. We tried long distance for a while, but anyone who's done that knows how hard it is to keep the momentum going when you're not in the same place. When we finally called it quits, it wasn't dramatic or messy, just sad. We both knew it wasn't working anymore, but neither of us wanted to be the one to say it out loud. When she came by one last time to pick up some things she'd left at my place, we ended up sitting in those chairs, watching a movie like we had so many times before. After she left, I thought about selling the chairs, just to get rid of the memories. But I didn't. They're still in my entertainment room, and every time I sit in them, I can't help but smile a little. This is not my personal experience. Let me make that clear up front. This is just one of many bizarre sexual encounters a friend of mine has facilitated through Craigslist. He's the kind of guy who treats Craigslist like his personal dating app, but with lower stakes and even lower standards. He actually refers to it as his go-to girl, and judging by the sheer number of stories he's told me over the years, it seems to work out surprisingly well for him. Now, before you start picturing him as some suave ladies' man, let me stop you right there. He's not. He's a regular dude, average-looking, slightly out of shape, and definitely not winning any fashion awards. What sets him apart, though, is his complete lack of shame or hesitation. He's the type who'll answer any ad without overthinking it, and more often than not, he ends up with a story to tell. This particular story starts with him responding to one of those couples' ads, the kind where a husband and wife are looking for a third. He'd answered a few of these before, so it wasn't uncharted territory for him, but this one stood out because it seemed classier than usual. No grainy photos or poorly worded descriptions, just a straightforward post that made it clear they were experienced and knew what they wanted. So he messages them, they exchange a few emails, and before he knows it, he's got an address and a time to show up. He told me he wasn't expecting much, probably a cramped apartment with mismatched furniture and a questionable smell. But when he pulled up, he realized this was something else entirely. The house was big. Not mansion level, but definitely a step above your typical suburban home. It had a long driveway, a manicured lawn, and those kinds of oversized windows that rich people seem to love. He told me it looked like the kind of place you'd see in a movie where someone gets murdered during a dinner party. Anyway, he knocks on the door, and the couple greets him. The wife was in her early 30s, blonde, fit, and pretty enough that he started wondering what the hell she was doing with the guy next to her. The husband, on the other hand, was in his 50s, slightly overweight, and had that look of someone who made decent money and knew it. My friend said he was wearing a sweater that probably cost more than his entire wardrobe. They invite him in, and right away, he notices the house is just as nice on the inside as it is on the outside. Hardwood floors, expensive-looking furniture, even a billiard room with a snooker table. They offer him a glass of wine, and before long, they're all sitting around chatting like old friends. The husband does most of the talking, asking my friend about his job, his hobbies, and his past experiences with threesomes. The wife chimes in here and there, but mostly, she just sips her wine and gives him this look that he described as hungry. Eventually, the conversation starts shifting in a more sexual direction, and before long, the wife stands up and says she's going to go get more comfortable. She disappears into the bedroom, leaving my friend and the husband alone. This is where things start to deviate. Instead of following her or giving my friend any kind of instructions, the husband just pours himself another glass of wine and sits back in his chair like he's settling in for a show. When the wife comes back, she's wearing nothing but lingerie, and the husband gives my friend a nod and says, "Let her have it." Now, my friend is the kind of guy who doesn't need to be told twice. He starts making out with her, and within minutes, they're going at it right there in the living room. The whole time, the husband just sits in his chair, sipping wine and watching with this weird, satisfied smile on his face. According to my friend, it was one of the strangest experiences of his life. He kept waiting for the husband to join in, or at least do something other than watch, but it never happened. The guy just sat there, completely content to let someone else take care of his wife. And it didn't stop after the first round. My friend says they had sex 2, maybe 3 times in a row, all while the husband stayed right where he was. At one point, he even topped off their glasses of wine, like it was the most normal thing in the world. By the end of it, my friend was exhausted. He said the wife was insatiable, and the husband seemed genuinely thrilled by the whole thing. When it was finally over, they thanked him, handed him another drink, and made casual small talk like they hadn't just spent the past couple of hours treating him like a living sex toy. He left shortly after, still trying to wrap his head around what had just happened. On the drive home, he kept replaying it in his head, trying to figure out the dynamic between them. Was the husband into voyeurism? Cuckolding? Or was it something else entirely? He never got an answer. They emailed him a couple of times afterward, inviting him back, but he never took them up on it. Not because it was bad, he actually said it was one of the better Craigslist hookups he'd had, but because it felt off. Like there was more going on under the surface than they were letting on, and he didn't really want to find out what it was. A few years ago, I heard this absolutely wild story about a guy in Europe who posted a Craigslist ad looking for someone planning to commit suicide. But here's the kicker. He didn't want to stop them or talk them out of it. No, he wanted them to go through with it in his home, so he could eat them afterward. Yeah, you read that right. Eat them. When I first heard it, I thought it was one of those urban legends people throw around at parties to creep each other out, but the more I dug into it, the more it seemed like it might actually be true. Apparently, the ad was straightforward. No weird metaphors or vague descriptions. Just a guy openly looking for someone who was ready to die and didn't mind becoming dinner in the process. The details of the case, at least what I could piece together, are equal parts disturbing and fascinating. From what I've read, the guy was surprisingly normal on the surface. No history of violent crimes, no bizarre public behavior that would have tipped anyone off. He was the kind of person you'd pass in the grocery store without giving a second glance. But behind closed doors, he had some of the darkest desires imaginable. The ad itself was chilling in its simplicity. He described wanting to share an intimate experience with someone willing to end their life, promising a safe and comfortable environment to do it in. Safe and comfortable, as if that somehow made it less horrifying. The worst part? People actually responded. Apparently, there's a corner of the internet where this kind of stuff doesn't just exist, it thrives. Forums, chat rooms, and hidden communities where people discuss their darkest thoughts, including fantasies about cannibalism. For most, it stays as fantasy, but this guy decided to take it a step further and make it real. The police caught wind of it when someone who saw the ad decided it was creepy enough to report. At first, it sounded too insane to be taken seriously, but when investigators looked into it, they realized it wasn't a hoax. The ad was real, and so was the man who posted it. From what I understand, they set up a sting operation to catch him. An undercover officer posed as someone who fit the profile he was looking for, suicidal and willing to meet. They exchanged messages, during which the man went into shocking detail about what he planned to do after the person died. He described the process step by step, even talking about how he'd prepare the body for consumption. When the day of the meeting arrived, the police raided his home. What they found inside sounded like something out of a horror movie. The guy had his house set up like he was hosting a dinner party, but for one guest, and that guest wasn't supposed to leave. There were tools, cooking supplies, and even a freezer cleared out to store what he didn't eat right away. He didn't deny anything either. Once he was caught, he admitted to the entire plan without hesitation, almost like he didn't understand why everyone was so horrified. He even tried to argue that it wasn't technically a crime because the other person was supposed to consent to it. That's the kind of mental gymnastics that makes you question how some people's brains work. I remember reading about how investigators combed through his computer and found years' worth of disturbing content, videos, pictures, and chats with other people who shared similar fantasies. He'd been obsessed with the idea for a long time, but for some reason, this was the moment he decided to act on it. What's even more unsettling is that cases like this aren't as rare as you'd hope. Every now and then, you hear about people getting caught with similar ads or engaging in these dark corners of the internet. Most don't go as far as actually trying to make it happen, but the fact that there's enough interest to sustain entire online communities is unsettling in itself. I can't help but wonder what kind of person responds to an ad like that. Were they genuinely suicidal and saw it as a way to end things while fulfilling someone else's twisted fantasy? Or were they just as messed up as the guy posting the ad and looking for a chance to be part of something horrifying? Either way, it's hard to wrap your head around. The thing that stuck with me most about the story, though, is how normal the guy seemed on the surface. It's easy to think of people like that as monsters, crazy, wild-eyed lunatics who can't blend into regular society. But the reality is often more unsettling. They look just like everyone else, which makes it harder to spot them until it's too late. After the arrest, the story blew up in the media, but it also faded pretty quickly. People have short attention spans, especially when something makes them uncomfortable. I tried to keep up with the case for a while, but eventually, the updates stopped coming, and I never found out what kind of sentence he ended up with. I love looking through Craigslist ads for shits and giggles. It's like people watching but with extra weirdness. Sometimes it's just harmless stuff. Someone trying to sell a broken lawnmower for way too much money, or offering free kittens that look like they've survived the apocalypse. But every so often, you find something so bizarre you can't help but click. That's exactly what happened the day I stumbled across an ad asking for a female model. The ad emphasized, in all caps, no nudity, like that was supposed to make it sound completely legitimate. Because obviously, if there's no nudity involved, there's nothing sketchy going on, right? Still, I couldn't help myself. I was curious. I wanted to know what this guy's angle was, so I decided to message him. I kept it simple. Hi, saw your ad. What exactly are you looking for in a model? I figured he'd either ghost me or respond with something vague and slightly creepy, but to my surprise, he got back to me almost immediately. His response was unexpected, to say the least. He said he wanted me to wear yoga shorts and rollerblades and have someone film me skating around. Then, at some point, I'd need to fall, wipe out hard enough to scrape my knee. After that, I was supposed to take detailed photos of myself tending to the scrape. We're talking disinfecting it, putting on ointment, applying a Band-Aid, the whole process. And for all of this, he offered me $100. I had to read the email twice just to make sure I wasn't missing something. Nope. That was the entire gig. Skating, falling, and documenting a scraped knee like it was some kind of medical fetish photo shoot. At first I laughed. It was ridiculous. Who pays someone to intentionally injure themselves? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how specific it was. This wasn't just some random request. This guy had clearly put a lot of thought into it. And that's what made it even weirder. I started imagining scenarios where this would make sense. Was it some kind of weird safety awareness campaign? Maybe a first aid instructional video? But no, that didn't add up. Why specify yoga shorts? Why rollerblades? And why focus so much on the wound care? The only explanation I could come up with was that this guy had a fetish. Not a normal one, either. Something hyper-specific, like skin knee caregiving or girls in distress. And once that thought hit me, I couldn't stop picturing him sitting in his basement, scrolling through Craigslist and waiting for someone to take the bait. I'll admit, for about 5 seconds, I actually considered doing it. $100 isn't life-changing, but it's enough to make you pause and weigh your options. I even imagined how I'd pull it off, borrowing a pair of rollerblades, practicing a convincing fall, and making sure the scrape looked bad, but not bad enough to leave a scar. The whole thing played out in my head like a bad rom-com montage. But then reality set in. What if this wasn't just a video thing? What if he wanted to meet in person? Or worse, what if he asked for more after seeing the photos? I started picturing myself tied up in some guy's basement next to a shrine of rollerblades and Band-Aids, and that was enough to shut the idea down completely. Still, I couldn't shake the curiosity. I decided to email him again, not to take the job, but to see if I could get more information. I asked him why he wanted the photos and what he planned to do with them. His response was polite but vague. He said he was working on a project and needed realistic images for reference purposes. That's it. No further details. When I pushed him for more, he stopped responding altogether. The whole thing left me equal parts fascinated and creeped out. On one hand, it was harmless compared to some of the other stuff lurking on Craigslist. At least he wasn't asking for nudes or offering to pay for dirty socks. But on the other hand, it made me wonder just how many people out there have these secret fetishes that never see the light of day, until they do. And it's not like this was a one-off thing. After that, I started noticing more ads with weirdly specific requests. One guy wanted photos of women's feet covered in mud. Another offered $50 for someone to sit on balloons until they popped. My personal favorite was the guy who wanted to pay women to eat messy foods, spaghetti, barbecue ribs, stuff like that, while wearing formal dresses. The ad itself seemed legit, although the rent was so low it was a bit questionable. Being a broke college student, I figured why the hell not at least check it out. The address given turned out to be a run-down lower middle-class house, not an apartment building like I was expecting. Okay, so it's someone renting out part of their house. Not my thing, and I'm about to put the car in reverse, when a middle-aged man with a huge beard comes out the front door. He's so excited that someone answered his ad. Well, all right, I'm here. Might as well see the place. We go in the front door, and he's showing me the first floor, while I'm looking about for the entrance to the apartment. Oh, he says, it's upstairs. Upstairs turns out to be just that, up a flight of stairs. There's no private door or entrance. It just opens up to a huge room. A huge room crammed full of mismatched second-hand beds and dressers. There's barely room to walk. I got all the furniture myself, he says proudly. I figure I can fit probably 20 girls up here. There's a shower downstairs that you all can use. I just feel real bad for college-age girls that ain't got no place to live. Did all this myself, so that you girls can have a place to stay. I don't care if you'll run around in your underwear and have pillow fights. Just have a good time. My only rules are no guys in the house, you know? I screwed a crazy from Craigslist once. She was nuts. I was in Tucson, Arizona, trying to sort my life out, and I wanted to make new friends. So I posted in the strictly platonic section explaining who I was, and that I was looking for a pal or two. After a few days I get some responses, and everything seems cool. So around the fourth response was an attractive female. Large but not fat, curvy but not chubby, so physically she was right up my alley, but since it was the platonic section, I wasn't expecting anything to come of it. Anyway, we meet up at the duck pond, and we're chatting it up, and things are going smooth, almost too smooth. I wasn't even laying groundwork, just being a friendly dude, and she was moving in on me, moving in fast. I say why the fuck not, and roll with it, and we end up at her place, since I was crashing on my sister's couch. As soon as I walk in, I see terrariums. Seriously. All over her house were tanks of snakes, and I'm not talking about a snake enthusiast with around 4 to 5 pets. I'm talking full-out snake breeder for the sake of keeping them for minions and taking over the world. This chick could tie all of them together and go cave diving and shit. But seriously, snakes all over. That was bad enough, but my dick isn't saying no, although my head was screaming GTFO dipshit. Anyway, we do the deed, and it was hardly enjoyable considering I was watching all around me for her to command the boas to hold me down, so she could rip my head off and feed me to her friends. As I lay there and say it's getting late and I should roll out, I hear someone coming into the apartment. So I ask her if she has a roommate. No, well yes. Sorta. This is the moment where I've got my shoes in my hands and my shirt slung over my shoulder bolting for the window when she says this. No, it's not what you think. I relax a little bit, hoping to hear her say it was her brother or some other relative, as long as they wouldn't hurt me for banging the snake queen. It's my ex-boyfriend. We split up a week ago, and we decided to stay living together. I'm figuratively shitting myself. I head again for the window when this burly-ass lumberjack beast of a bear man built like a brick shit house walks right into the room and continues to the bathroom to get something. All the while I'm standing in my boxers with my pants around my ankles and my shirt over my shoulder. He emerges from the bathroom about 5 seconds later with one hand behind his back, and I'm sure it's all over, but I'm frozen solid with fear and can't move an inch. He speaks. Hey dude. I respond, hey. He advances toward me, and the chick is freaking out about her fucking snakes like, don't hurt my baby's Chad. You be careful in here. And he pulls from behind his back the metal shower curtain rod he ripped from the wall in the bathroom. I boogie. I dash for the window as quick as you can with your pants around your ankles, and try to crawl out. He swings that rod and fucking whips it over my ass just as I fall out into the yard. I throw my shoes on and pull up my pants with speed comparable to that of Sonic the Hedgehog on cocaine, and jump fences until I don't recognize where I am or how long Eve been running. I call my sister from a payphone and get her to pick me up, never using Craigslist to meet people again. A lady came to buy our old coffee table off Craigslist. It was nothing fancy, just a basic wooden coffee table we'd had for years, with a few scratches and dents that gave it character, or at least that's what I told myself when we were trying to sell it. We listed it for $20, mainly to get it out of the house without feeling like we were throwing it away. When she showed up, she seemed normal enough. Middle-aged, well-dressed, and driving a decent car. Nothing about her screamed serial killer or hoarder, which is always a plus when you're meeting strangers off the internet. She walked up, looked over the table, and said, "This will work perfectly. I need new furniture because my house just burned down." My partner and I froze for a second. I mean, what do you even say to that? We were halfway through loading the table into her car, and suddenly this turned into the world's most awkward therapy session. Finally, one of us managed to blurt out, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry." She just shrugged and gave us this calm, almost cheerful smile. "It's no big deal. No big deal. I don't know about you, but if my house burned down, I'd be a wreck." Meanwhile, this lady was out here furniture shopping like it was just another Tuesday. She wasn't crying, she wasn't stressed, she was completely unbothered. Honestly, it was kind of impressive. Still, we felt bad for her, so we decided to let her have the table for free. It felt like the least we could do. We even started carrying it to her car for her when she interrupted us. "Oh, it's no problem," she said, reaching into her purse. "I have plenty of money. I just don't have any stuff because my house burned down." And with that, she handed us the $20 like it was nothing. Now we were extra confused. Who loses everything in a fire and immediately bounces back like this? I'm not saying I expected her to show up in rags with soot stains on her face, but something about how casual she was felt off. Still, we thanked her, handed over the table, and offered our condolences again, figuring that was the polite thing to do. "We're so sorry that your house burned down," we said, fully expecting her to finally drop the upbeat act and admit that, yeah, it had been a pretty rough week. Instead, she looked us dead in the eye and said, "It's okay. I'm used to it. Used to it." What do you even say to that? My brain immediately started spiraling. How many houses does someone have to burn down before they get used to it? Was she cursed? Did she have the world's worst luck with electrical wiring? Or, and this was the theory my partner whispered the second she drove off, was she an arsonist? Because let's be honest, nobody casually drops, "I'm used to it," unless this isn't their first fire, or their second, or their third. For the rest of the day, we couldn't stop talking about it. We kept replaying the conversation, trying to figure out what we missed. Maybe she was joking, and we just didn't pick up on it. Or maybe she'd been through so much trauma that this was her way of coping. Either way, we were officially creeped out. Later that night, we started Googling house fires in the area, half expecting to find some news report about a string of mysterious blazes. We didn't, but that almost made it worse. What if she was just really good at covering her tracks? I couldn't shake the image of her driving away with that coffee table, smiling like she hadn't just dropped the weirdest bombshell on us. Did she already have a plan for the table? Or was it destined to go up in flames, too? And what kind of person collects furniture immediately after a fire? Wouldn't you be dealing with insurance claims, or trying to find a place to stay? But no, this lady was out here bargain hunting like she just Marie Kondoed her house instead of watching it burn to the ground. Over the next few weeks, I kept expecting her to pop back up. Maybe she'd call about more furniture, or maybe we'd see her name in the news after yet another house fire. But she never did. It was like she disappeared as quickly as she arrived, leaving us with nothing but questions and a very crisp $20 bill. To this day, I still don't know what her deal was. I've told this story to so many people, and every single one has the same reaction. WTF, lady? When I was 21, I transferred to a college in San Francisco. I checked out a room for rent on Craigslist. It was in a really nice 2-bedroom apartment. It was cheap rent and close to campus, so it was the ideal spot. The girl who lived there was 29, and her name was Beth. She was tall and wide, and she had jet black hair and wore pale makeup. She seemed nice, although a little quiet. But she seemed to like me, and agreed to let me move in. So far, so good. My first night there we went out for pizza, and that's when I could tell that something was a little bit off with her. Throughout dinner she kept telling me how much I looked like Shia LaBeouf. I didn't know what to say, so I just shrugged it off with a, "Thanks?" I mean, I looked nothing like Shia LaBeouf, so it just didn't make any sense to me. When we got back home, she asked if I had seen her room yet. I said no, and so she took me to see it. Her walls were covered in posters of Shia LaBeouf. She even had printed out photos of him all over her mirror. She owned all his movies. I didn't know what to make of it. It was creepy. The whole night she had been saying I looked like him, and now it's obvious to me that she's obsessed with the guy. A few weeks passed, and I never really saw her that much. We didn't spend any time together, really. She would come home from work and practically run to her room. She would spend the whole night in there. She had this creepy high-pitched giggle, and I would hear her giggling through the walls all night. I wondered what the hell she could possibly be doing. Occasionally she would come out and talk for like 2 minutes, and she would always be slurring her words, so I suspected she was drinking a lot. Sometimes she wouldn't say anything, and she would just stand in the hallway and watch me in the living room. I would turn and see her and be surprised and say, "Hello, Beth," and then there would be this long awkward pause, and she would give out her creepy high-pitched giggle. It was uncomfortable being around her. She gave me the chills. One night I woke up at around 2 a.m. because I heard what sounded like the front door being unlocked. I came out of my bedroom, and all the lights were off, but I could still see Beth standing at the front door. She had her face against it, and she was turning the lock back and forth over and over again. And every time she turned the bolt, she mumbled my name. Max Barker, Max Barker, Max Barker. Seeing her standing in the dark and mumbling my name really freaked me out. And it doesn't help that she kind of looks like a bigger version of the girl from The Ring. I just quietly went back to my room and tried to sleep. One night I was watching Gladiator, and she stumbled out of her room and turned on the living room light, forcing me to pause the movie, which was annoying. She then asked me if I wanted to hear about her ex-boyfriend. It was an uneasy segue into the topic, but I just said sure, and then awkwardly sat back to listen to her. 10 minutes into her story, and she was so riled up. She was screaming at the top of her lungs about their breakup. I was worried that the neighbors were going to call the cops, and she wasn't listening to me when I was asking her to lower the volume. Amidst all of her screaming, one thing she said really freaked me out. She was in such a fit and yelled, "I'll slit his fucking throat." That was a big game changer. Suddenly I had no idea what this girl was capable of. She was practically a stranger, and everything I had seen was becoming alarmingly disturbing. After a few more minutes, she told me thanks for listening, and she startled doing her giggle. I got out of there pretty fast and went to my room to go to sleep. I had a pretty unsettled feeling about being in the house with her, and what's worse is that there was no lock on my bedroom door. I pushed the edge of my dresser in front of it to act as a little barricade. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of my dresser scraping against the floor. Beth was pushing the door open. I turned on my light, shouting at her to stop. I could see her through the opening of the door. She was so drunk and had this insane look in her eyes. I pushed the door closed and yelled at her to go to bed. I could hear her walk back to her room, but I couldn't fall back asleep. The next morning when I went out into the hallway, my heart dropped. I saw one of her steak knives was on the floor by my door. I got goosebumps all over my arms. All I could think about was her saying she would slit that guy's throat. I confronted her about it, and she said she didn't remember trying to push my door open. She said she didn't even remember telling me about her ex. I had enough. My lease was month to month, so I found a new spot and moved out. About a month after I moved out, she contacted me. I was at the movies, and my phone was off. When I got out, I turned my phone on, and to my shock, I received in 40-plus text messages that she had sent me over the past 2 hours. They were all just insane texts that ranged from everything between, "Hi, how are you?" to "I fucking hate you." It was insane. I didn't respond, and I never heard from her again. I always wonder if I hadn't set my dresser in front of my door, would she have quietly come into my room and slit my throat? It freaks me out. I guess everyone has heard about a Craigslist horror story, but no one expects to end up in one. I'd been thinking about leaving the city life behind for a while now. I guess I couldn't stand the bustle of the city anymore, and longed for a more remote life. I'd saved up quite a bit of money over the years, and decided to buy a house. When I saw the prices though, my jaw dropped. I'd expected that buying a house was expensive, but I'd never thought that expensive. In my desperation, I opened Craigslist. I didn't expect to find anything there, but that's exactly what I did. The ad was as simple as it could be. Small house for sale, way below market value. I clicked on it in an instant. When I saw the price though, I was sure the seller had made a mistake. There was no way someone would sell a house that cheap. The place looked decent from what I saw in the pictures. Eventually, I found the seller's phone number and called him. I honestly expected the price to be a mistake. Hell, maybe it was all a scam. Instead, I found myself on a call with a man named Wilbert Johnson. When he told me the place was still available, the first thing I asked about was the price. The old man assured me there was no mistake. It was an old house, he said, in the middle of nowhere, and he wanted to get the sale over with as soon as possible. There was a catch, though. He wanted the payment in cash only because he didn't trust the banks or any of the real estate agents. Some other people had shown interest before me, he said, but they'd all gotten cold feet at the mention of this. I didn't see a problem with it. Hell, things would be way quicker that way. I guess that was my first mistake. To make a long story short, a week later, on a Saturday morning, I found myself on the 3-hour drive to old Wilbert's house, which I hoped would soon be mine. When I arrived, the old man greeted me with a bright smile. He was a sturdy, hard man in his late 50s, from what I could tell. "You Mark?" he asked as he reached out to greet me. I nodded. "Yes, sir." "Well, that's the place," he said and stepped aside to allow me a better view of the small house. I had to look around for a bit before I stepped inside. The moment I did, the old floorboards welcomed me with a loud creak. The moment it happened, an anxious expression washed over the man's face. "Guess you were right," I said laughing. "The place is pretty old." "It sure is character, though." When he heard that, relief flooded over his face, and his smile returned. "Oh, that it has. Been living here for over 30-odd years. Now then, how come you're selling it that cheap?" The old man was quiet for a bit. His eyes wandered for a bit before he sighed. "Tell you what, there's no reason to keep it to myself. It's because of Lisa's disappearance." "Lisa?" Another sigh followed. "My wife, Elizabeth. Been almost 2 months now since she vanished. Walked right out that door over there and never returned. No one's seen her, no one's heard a thing. Just like that, vanished without a trace." "Shit, I'm so sorry. I'd no idea, Dash. Nothing to do with you." He cut me off. "Did everything I could, talked to the neighbors, then the cops. Hell, they searched half the damned county, but they found nothing. I kept searching, but by now..." His voice trailed off as he shook his head. "Can't keep living here. Everything reminds me of her. That painting over there, she drew it a good 20 years ago. See that tablecloth? She bought it at a flea market a couple of years back. Isn't it beautiful, Wilbert?" she asked. "Been stuck with the ugly thing ever since. Whenever I see it, I can't help but wonder where she went and what happened to her. It's just too much," he broke up, his voice trailing off. I stood there, shuffling around, not sure what to say. I was never good at those things, people things, I mean. After a few moments, I opened my mouth when I heard something. It was a small, quiet sound, like scratching. In a moment, old Wilbert stepped up to an old radio and turned it on. I stared at him as the music drowned out the sound. "Sir, what are you, Dash?" When he noticed my stares, he looked embarrassed and turned the radio back off again. "Well, that's another reason the place is so cheap. So what's causing it? Ghosts?" I stared at him, but his expression didn't change. I opened my mouth to inquire what the hell was up with that when he burst out laughing. "Goddamn it, I'm pulling your leg. It's rodents. We've had problems with the damned beasts for half a decade now. Dunno where the buggers come from, but they sure are persistent. They're digging through the dirt outside and crawl into the walls. Never been able to figure out how they do it. Might as well be a cat in there, too. Heard they sometimes crawl after mice or cat and end up getting stuck." I shrugged. "Well, I planned on renovating the place, anyway. Remember you telling me about that. I've got quite a bit of junk stored up. Been planning to give the place a good old once-over myself, but with Lisa going missing and all that, I never had time to do it." With that, he led me to his garage and presented me with an assortment of tools and materials. "Tell you what, I'll add all of it to the house for free. God knows, I can't take it with me anyway, and I sure as hell won't need it anymore. Take it as an apology for not telling you about the rodents beforehand." I thanked the old man wholeheartedly. Looking at the amount of stuff here, I might well be looking at $500,000, hell, maybe even more. We talked more while the old man led me through the house. Here and there he stopped me and told me what sort of renovations he'd planned and gave me detailed advice. "Start with the second floor, use this and that material, do this that way, and so on." It sounded like solid advice, and I could tell the old man knew what he was talking about. Once the tour was over, we shook on the sale, and I arranged to be back in a few days to finalize everything. The old man, in turn, told me he'd put together a little write-up of all his renovation advice. Once I was back, and I handed him the money, he sighed again. "Guess there's one last thing I've got to tell you. This place, well, it's got a history." I looked up. First the rodents and now what? "It's probably all nonsense." He started shaking his head. "But Lisa always talked about that stuff. She said back in the day when folks still owned slaves, there's been a lynching out here. Never gave much of a damn about those old tales, but..." This time I couldn't help but laugh. Was he pulling my leg again? Tell you what, I never believed in any of it, but Lisa swore she heard wailing and crying in the middle of the night. To be honest, I think it's just those damned kids down by the creek. "What kids?" "There's this old shack down by the creek, not too far from here. Some local kids, teenagers mostly, hang out there getting drunk and causing all kinds of trouble during the night. Well, it doesn't sound like anything I can't handle." It was a few minutes later that we shock on the deal. The old man handed me his notes and told me he'd written down his phone number. If I had questions about the renovations, I should call him. Once he'd driven off, I stared at what would be my new home. Quite the place, I thought. Sure, I'd have to put in quite a bit of work, but there was no way I'd get a cheap property anywhere. For the first couple of nights, I didn't sleep in the place. There was still all the old man's furniture in there. No, to feel comfortable here, I'd have to get rid of his stuff first. To be honest, it felt weird, disposing of someone's entire life and memories like that. Even worse was the damned scratching. It was there again and again. Sometimes it was quiet, sometimes it was more frantic. Maybe there really was a cat stuck somewhere. I shuddered a bit. I liked cats, and I didn't want to think about one of them suffocating in my walls. The next day my friend Mike arrived. I'd told him about the house I was buying, and he said he'd be happy to help me out with the renovations. To be honest, I think he wanted to get away from his wife and kids for a bit. Do some good old handy work, and share a couple of cool ones with an old buddy. Well, it's quite the place. You really got it that cheap? Yeah, it's because the place is haunted, and there are mice in the walls, and rats and cats. Mike gave me a weird look. Come on in, I tell you all about it over a beer or two. As the two of us sat on the floor in what would one day be my kitchen, I told him all about old Wilbert and the stories he'd told me. As if to prove that I wasn't bullshitting him, the frantic scratching started again for a moment. He listened intently. Doesn't sound like mice to me. Could be rats, though. We're better of getting some poison, or call an exterminator. I considered it for a moment, but then I shook my head. If we get an exterminator, they'll cover the entire place in chemicals or God knows what. I'd rather get started on the renovations. Mike shrugged. Well, I warned you, don't blame me if we find some giant rat colony in one of the walls here. We shared another beer before we started on the work. There was a lot to do. The floorboards were old and rotten in many places. The wallpaper was stained and old-fashioned, and some partition walls had to go, I decided. Either way, we had a busy few days ahead of us, hell, maybe even a week. It wasn't long before we retorted to the old man's method of turning on the radio. The scratching, while quiet, was still somewhat distracting. Mike and I made some decent progress the first day. At first, he wanted to get himself a hotel room in the nearby town, but after a bit of back and forth, he agreed to stay. We spent the evenings talking about old stories from high school and college, and often Mike would tell me about his wife and kids. As much as he told me he was happy to have some time away, I could tell he missed them already. During our third night at the place, he woke me up in the middle of the night. "Dude, you hearing this?" he asked me in a quiet, hushed voice. As I listened, I could hear the scratching, but there was something else. It was quiet, coming from quite a distance, but I was sure I heard it. It sounded as if someone was wailing or crying. I thought back to the old man's story about the lynching and what his wife had heard. Then I shook my head and remembered what he'd told me about the kids out here. Probably some drunk kids fucking around. The old dude told me they're gathering down by the creek to get drunk. Maybe they thought it was fun to mess with the new guy. Mike nodded, but he still looked unnerved. Yeah, guess you're right. Want to go out and teach them a lesson? I laughed but shook my head. There was no way I'd go out in the middle of the night to chase some teenagers. I also didn't want to become known as the local crazy guy. Eventually, we got back to sleep. Still, somehow my mind lingered on the story. That scratching, that wailing, there was something about it that didn't seem to fit. The next day, busy with renovations again, I'd already pushed all those thoughts away. Guess that was my second mistake. We doubled down on our efforts. Me trying to find a hint of those damned rodents, and Mike most likely wanting to get out of here. He'd always been the superstitious type. When the wailing started again on the fourth night, Mike told me he'd get a hotel room if it would persist. I retorted that it was those kids again, but this time he wouldn't have it. Yeah, so you're telling me there's some group of kids out there that got nothing better to do in the middle of the night? 2 times in a row. Fuck man, I don't know. Maybe it's a cat stuck somewhere. I sure as hell don't believe there are any freaking ghosts. Mike grunted, but said nothing. For a while, I considered going out there to figure out who or what was causing it, but not long after I drifted off to sleep again. At this point, we were on the 5th day of renovations. The place was almost barren by now. We'd started on the upper floor first. After that, we'd taken down the partition walls and had stripped down the old wallpaper. Not knowing too much about renovations myself, I'd followed the old man's guidelines almost to the letter. That was my third mistake. So, what else you want me to take care of? Well, you could clean the garage for starters, and that lawn looks like it hasn't been cut in months. All right, hilarious Mark, he said when he saw the enormous grin on my face. Tell you what, I started. How about we take a bit of a break for the rest of the day? Tomorrow we take care of the floorboards down here, and that's it. God knows those need to be replaced. As if to prove what I'd said, I switched my balance a bit, and the floorboards creaked in answer. Sounds good, but if we hear any weird noises again, I'm out of here. I sighed but nodded. Then I realized something. I had heard none of the scratching today. Maybe our ruckus had driven off whatever rodents had infested the place. I didn't know a damn thing about mice or rats. That night we sat together until long after midnight. I'd brought out my old laptop, and we spent the time with some old movies and a bottle of whiskey. Not a sound was heard all night. No more scratching, and sure as hell no wailing. Told you there are no ghosts here, I slurred. Yeah, whatever, Mike said laughing. Taking care of the old floorboards was much tougher than I'd imagined, with a hangover that is. Still, somehow we made decent enough progress, and by noon we were done with the first half of the house. Guess those rats really are gone, aren't they? I shrugged. Guess so, not a sound. To be honest, I half expected them to linger below those old boards. Sure hope they stay the hell away. We continued joking around and having a good time. It all changed when we found the basement. As we removed the floorboards in the old man's storage room, we stumbled upon an old hatch. Once our initial surprise was over, we pried it open, revealing a staircase. All right, man, what the hell? The basement, I guess, I said matter-of-factly. Yeah, I ain't blind, but why the hell's it hidden like that? Things still hadn't clicked. Who knows, maybe he just didn't use it. Hell, maybe it was infested by rodents, so he sealed it off. Yeah, or it's his secret serial killer basement. Dude, not funny, I cursed. All right, you want to check it out? As I looked down the dark stairs that led, somewhere below a feeling of apprehension washed over me. I didn't feel so sure about my words anymore. Finally, I nodded. We each got a hold of a flashlight and started our descent. There was no light down there, and for a moment I half expected the old hatch to be thrown shut by no other than old Wilbert himself. Shit, man, this is creepy, I mumbled. Will you stop? I don't like this any more than you do. Once we'd made it down the stairs, we found ourselves in a small, damp room. It was empty. Small, isn't it? Sure is, I said. The entire basement was no bigger than one of the rooms above. Wasn't a basement usually the same size as the house? At least there are no rats, I said. Yeah, but this wall here's kinda weird. What do you mean? Well, he started. Look at the moss and the dirt on all the others. This one's different. Looks kinda new to me. Now that he'd said it, I noticed it too. Sure, the wall was as damp as the rest, but there was no moss on it or anything. I watched as Mike reached out his hand and knocked against the wall. What are you doing? I asked. Shuh, he shushed me. He went to one of the other walls and knocked there, then came back and knocked again. Sounds hollow. We both stared at each other. You think that's where the rodents came from? A minute later we were down there again, starting to tear down the wall. After a few heavy hits, the first of the bricks collapsed inwards. I instinctively took a step back, expecting rats or mice to pour from the hole, but there was nothing. We inched forward, peeking into the hole, and that's when we realized what this was. The second half of the basement. Mike had already gotten his flashlight and beamed inside. At first, we saw nothing, but then we saw something on the floor. No, not something. There's someone inside, I pressed out. We redoubled our efforts, and soon we'd broken down enough of the wall to enter. The person inside had long gray hair, wore a dirty nightgown, and was female. The old woman's face was frozen into a mask of perpetual terror, and she was without a doubt dead. When I saw the long, bloody scratch marks all over the walls, it finally clicked. A moment later I was back upstairs and called to police, telling them what I'd found. There was no need for them to tell me the woman's name. The moment I'd understood what was going on here, I knew who she was. It was Elizabeth Johnson, the old man's wife. Everyone has heard Craigslist horror stories, but last night I experienced one firsthand. For about a week I have been speaking to a guy regarding a laptop I wanted to buy. After a slew of cancellations due to family issues, he eventually gave me an address that checked out on Google Maps yesterday and organized pickup that evening. On arrival at the address, he said to give him a call, but wouldn't give me an app number. I was given some extremely vague directions in broken English, and eventually an app number that didn't exist in that complex. My alarm bells started ringing, and I made my way back to my car. From across the road, a figure appeared. He was head to toe in black with a balaclava on. To my horror, in his left hand, he had a machete that went from his knee to his foot. "Hey buddy, give me the fucking money," was all he said. Panicking, I started backpedaling down the road, and luckily a bus came round the corner. I flagged it down screaming for help, however the bus driver wouldn't stop to let me on. At this point, I thought, shit, this is it. Luckily another car was driving up, which I managed to scramble to. Obviously, I shocked them, and they simply put their windows up, signaled to the bus, which had stopped, maybe realizing that something was up. The driver finally let me on, and people moved to the back of the bus, obviously thinking I was some crazed lunatic. No one offered me any help, and crying my eyes out, clearly distressed, I dialed 911. I was picked up at production station by the police and driven back to the scene, where there was a number of dog units on hand. This process took 15 minutes, so the guy was long gone. During this whole time, the guy was still texting me asking where I was. I have received a number of calls since. There are too many coincidences for it to seem like an opportunist thief hanging out in the bushes that just so happened to try to mug a guy that was buying a laptop. I was asked via text, what color car are you driving, and what color jacket you wearing, and the whole meet me on a pathway near a unit that doesn't exist is also suspect. I know I'm going to receive the usual, how could you be so stupid comments, but I just wanted to share the experience on the off chance anyone has had the same thing happen to them. I use Craigslist a lot to buy and sell. I never thought this would happen to me. And the fact I still don't know if it was a setup or not really bugs me. The ad is still up, which just adds to the mystery. I really love Craigslist. I'd estimate I've met maybe 300 people for buying/selling stuff, and for the most part, everyone was nice and harmless. However, I did run into a creep who made me rethink meeting strangers alone to sell stuff. FYI, I was an early 20s female at the time. It's 2009, and I'm staying with my parents for the Christmas holidays in a small town in Florida. I'm going through my childhood room and cleaning out the closet and find a giant CD holder full of maybe 100 really shitty CDs. Think Nickelback, Aqua, Chumbawamba. It's the 21st century. No one uses CDs anymore. I figure I'd try to sell the CDs on Craigslist. I put up a listing. 100 CDs from the late 90s and early to mid 2000s, mix of pop and rock. All for $35 OBO. The next day, I get an email from a guy named John around 2 p.m. He says that he's in town temporarily and that he wants the CDs. He says he can pick them up after dinner around 8 p.m. I email him back my address and number and tell him to text or call when he's on his way. 8 p.m. comes and goes. I figure I've been stood up, which happens often on Craigslist. No big deal. My dad works for a liquor distribution company and would often do demonstration nights at restaurants and bars and would come home at bar closing time. This night, he gets home at around 3 a.m. I'm in college and a total night owl, so I'm still up probably eating junk food, surfing the web, and watching horror flicks. I hear a car pull up, look out the window, and see him sitting in his car eating food. He often stops at Taco Bell on his way home and eats it in his car, so my mom doesn't know he's cheating on his diet. Maybe 10 minutes later, my dad comes in and shouts my name. Pizza_succubus. There is someone here to see you. Can you please tell me why a strange man is showing up at our house at 3 a.m.? Huh. I go downstairs, and my dad says some guy pulled up in the driveway and asked for me by name. I walk outside with my dad, and this guy who is maybe mid-30s gets out of his car. He says he's the Craigslist guy who wanted to buy my CDs. My dad goes back in the house. I tell the guy it's really, really late to just be stopping by, especially without texting first. However, since I'm awake, I go and grab the CDs. He then proceeds to drone on and on about why he's buying the CDs. He says he's engaged to a woman he loves very much, and all he wants to do is make her happy. He said that last week, someone broke into her car and stole all of her CDs. She was really upset, and he wanted to make it up to her. He looked on Craigslist and found my listing, and was really excited because I had a bunch of the CDs she used to have. Weird thing is, I didn't list any of the artists/bands because I was lazy, but I didn't think about that at the time. Anyway, he said he was getting it for her as a Christmas surprise. He said he was staying with his future in-laws somewhere nearby, and that their family barbecue ran really late, which is why he never made it at 8 p.m. By this point, I've lost interest and say something along the lines of, "That's sweet. Next time, you should probably call or text the Craigslister instead of just showing up." I hand him the CDs, he hands me cash, and I go back inside. 3 days later, I start getting texts from an unknown number. "Hey, I don't know my way around this town. Care to tour guide Winky Face? I could really use a massage. Where can I get a massage in this town? You're Asian. Do you do massage? Would you take $40 for a 1-hour massage? Happy ending? Me finally. Who the F is this? Him, oh sorry. I bought the CDs from you the other day. Do you squirt? I didn't respond obviously. I show my friends that night, and we laugh it off. Then the next day, I get more texts. I still have your address. I'm at the Bank of America near your neighborhood. I just got the $40, babe, laughing face. Only 3 minutes away. Are you home? You stop ignoring me. I'm almost there. I immediately ran downstairs to tell my dad and mom. It was night time, so we shut off all of the lights outside and inside my house. My mom, little brother, and I went in my parents' room in the back of the house. My dad hid behind the curtains of the front bay window with a shovel in his hand. A few minutes later, I heard him run down the front hallway, fling the front door open, and run outside. We heard some faint shouting, so we all walked out of the bedroom. By that time, my dad came back in with his shovel, his face red and his hair all disheveled. Apparently, the guy came driving down our street really slowly. My dad recognized the car and went running outside with the shovel, yelling obscenities at the guy. The guy peeled off and never came back or texted me again.